organized by the Artists for Progressive Politics. We are sort of a pan-Indian independent group of artists and creatives who are in support of progressive politics. We generally work on different medium wherein we've tried to highlight the struggles of the working class and the marginalized, the contribution of the left, as well as to have some appreciation for the history of the working class in India. So given over the past few months, we've contributed to various events and art collectives which reflect struggles of trade unions, students, organizations, as well as organized a few talks along the way. The last time we had a talk by Ting Stuck on the international art collectives and the history of progressive art and how it forges solidarity across the third world. And today we have with us Comrade Sudhanva Deshpande. Comrade Sudhanva is a theatre director and an actor. He joined Jannatya Manch in 1987. The last record that we have is perhaps that he's done over 4,100 plays, but we'll leave it up to him to give us the exact number. He's also someone who's contributed to various articles and essays across various popular magazines, as well as contributed to editorials. He's also one of the editors at Leftward Books and has recently written a book on the life and death of Safdar Hashmi called Halla Bol. So, Comrade Sudhanva, it's great that you could join us and great that you could continue your association with us, and glad to have you here in this platform. So this is perhaps our second event where we are broadcasting live on YouTube to have a discussion about art, progressive politics, and its history in India. So welcome and thank you.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay. So, Kamit, so what we'll try and do is sort of many of us over the past few months have sort of gone about some of these questions which we've tried to figure out about the role of art and creatives in the case of the left movement in India. And it would be great if you could, like, so firstly just talk us through the sort of history that has been present. I mean, not many are aware of the fact that this contribution goes back almost to times before independence, with the start of the Progressive Writers Association. You had, you know, many stalwarts such as Rashida Jahan, Mahmud Zafar. When they started Angare, it continued with Premchand, Mulk Raj Anand, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, right up to Safdar Hashmi, and then of course to all of you who have continued to take forward that legacy. So could you just tell us as to how it has been sort of integral to the working class movement and to the contribution of the left, at least in the Indian subcontinent?
Soon after we began our street theatre work in 1978, Safdar Hashmi wrote a little note, which was meant for internal circulation. It wasn't meant to be published. And this was a note that he wrote after about maybe 4 months of doing street theatre work, in which we had already prepared 2 plays that had been, performed at 2 more various stages of being worked upon. And one of the things that he says in that note is that street theatre is the newspaper of the working class. Now, what does he mean by a newspaper of the working class? Now, he doesn't obviously mean that it gives you daily news in that sense, because obviously you can't have a new street play every day. And what's the reach of a street play after all? It can't be literally the newspaper. But what he meant, in my view, is that just as the mainstream media at that time, 1978, it was essentially newspapers, because all the broadcast uh, uh, technologies were all state controlled and state owned. You had radio, you had television, but they were all controlled by the state. So newspapers were really the only other thing that was available in terms of the media. And all of these were owned and still are owned, obviously, by big corporates, by, by companies, by capitalists. So therefore, if they have their, if this movement needs something, and in that sense, street theater, he said, is the newspaper of the working class. What he also meant was, and later, a little bit later, he also started thinking about the history of street theater. And one of the things that he says again there is that the street theater, uh, very much continues the tradition of of the wall of the slogan written on the wall, or the wall poster, or the handbill of the 19th century working class movement, and the working class itself as a class broadcast their view. Now, and it's in the early 20th century, especially around the Russian Revolution, that in India, of course, there's a slightly different trajectory, there's a slightly different movement, because in the late 19th century, again in India, you see, for instance, in Maharashtra, uh, there is the Satya Shodhak Samaj, founded by Jyotirao Phule. Now, one of the things that the Satya Shodhak Samaj does, under Phule's sort of, inspired by his vision, is that they start something called the Satya Shodhaki Jalsa. Now, the Satya Shodhaki Jalsa is where singers come together and uh, uh, they sing songs that are on the one side composed in the tradition of the ballads, the povada and so on. In Maharashtra, these are narrative songs, long songs that extol the heroism uh, of heroes. And Phule uses the form of the povada and turns it on its head. So it becomes a way in which he starts to construct of the Bahujans, in a sense, I mean, the word Bahujan didn't exist in his time. Uh, what he termed it as was the Shudradi Shudras, the Shudras and the Ati Shudras. In today's terms, that would mean essentially, the OBCs and the Dalits, let's say. So, Bahujan Samaj, generally speaking. And so he uses the form of the Povada. He also takes off on the form of the Bhakti poetry of the medieval ages in Maharashtra, and turns that also into a weapon of the Bahujans. And so these are processions that walk through villages and towns and so on, where they stop, they sing, and they explain what is happening in the tradition, that then gets uh, uh, picked up by Ambedkar, and you have the Ambedkari Jalsas. Now that's the same tradition which today, if you see in the performances of people like Sambhaji Bhagat or Sridhar Sathe, etc., that is very much the tradition. In between, of course, there are the famous shahirs of the IPTA. There's Amar Sheikh, there's Gavankar, there's um, Annabhav Sathe, who also compose lavnis and povadas and so on, and turn these into political weapons, into ways in which you make sense of the world from the perspective of the Dalit Bahujan, from the perspective of the oppressed, from the perspective of the working class and so on. So this idea that you have forms that belong to the rich, that belong to the oppressors, that belong to the ruling classes, you don't have access to them because you don't have the capital that it requires to bring out, let's say, a newspaper or or whatever. But you do have forms that can become part of your movement, through which you broadcast your worldview, and you teach people how to make sense of the world, right? And I use the word teach quite deliberately, because it's not as if this teaching is a one-way street. It's not like somebody is sitting there and, telling you that this is right and this is wrong. No, it's teaching in the best sense of, uh, Marx has this phrase that that the that the teachers must themselves be taught. Lenin also picks up on this idea and so on. So it's in that sense, it plays a very important pedagogic role in the revolutionary movement. And that's the tradition of which I think that Jannaty Manch is a part. And so therefore, I also count myself as a part of that much longer tradition.
I mean, thanks for that comment. I mean, especially the part where you said that the use of different art forms and in many senses sort of inverting it to make sure that, whether it's the street theater as a newspaper for the working class, or the use of more traditional folk art, or the use of popular plays or shairis by these stalwarts who are not just artists in themselves, but were also political personalities in their own rights in terms of how they went about things. There's also one thing that many of us who are part of this progressive collective and otherwise, which we do discuss, is that how is it that you go about using such forms towards forwarding progressive politics? I mean, you said that it's about how do we teach a perspective to a wider audience, but it's also about learning yourself as to how you go about doing it. Is it simply the preserving of a form and changing its content, or is it the other way around, or is it something completely different? I mean, especially since you have done many adaptations of different plays, and including the Jananatyam Manch, which is, for instance, translated a lot of Bertolt Brecht's work, for instance. How do you guys go about thinking on this, and like, how do we learn how to do this is something that's a question which often arises. We'll just give it a minute. Perhaps his connection's a bit unclear.
So I'll answer this in a slightly roundabout way. I'll take the example of street theater. And one of the things that you find, is it better now?
Sumit, sorry to disturb you. Could you just start again? Sorry, we lost the first part there.
Is it somewhat better
Yeah,
now?
the audio is better.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah. So I was saying that in street theater, one of the things that often happens within the street theater movement is that there are two things that get said often. They get repeated often enough. One is that street theater is some kind of a revolt against proscenium theater, or mainstream theater that happens inside auditorium. It's a revolt against that in some way. That's one thing that gets said about street theater. The other thing that gets said about street theater is that street theater is only street theater if it does not use any of the technologies of the traditional theater. In other words, you have to keep it as sparse as possible, use as little material, etc. If you use any kind of technology, then you're somehow betraying the cause of street theater, and so on and so forth. In Jannaty Manch, we don't believe in either of these things. Once again, I'll quote Safdar, and Safdar in one of his articles very persuasively argued that we are not against proscenium theater. That's not why we took to street theater. We took to street theater because there was a need to do that at that particular point of time. That the organizations for which we were doing the plays, and we were doing much bigger plays earlier, between 1973 to 1978, we were doing massive plays. These were, mounted on big stages with lights, sets, properties, etc., etc., and they were expensive to mount. Back in the early 70s, if a play cost, 5,000 rupees to mount, then that's a lot of money that organizations of the working class could not really afford, especially after the emergency. So therefore, these organizations said to us that, comrade, we need your plays, but we don't have the financial capacity to afford them.
mm,
Now, when that happened, Jannatimans, again under Savda's direction or his leadership, said, well, all right, if we can't take big plays to the people, we'll take small plays to the people. That's how we turned to street theater. So it wasn't like we were revolting against the established theater and so on.
mm,
Savdar says that there's no contradiction between street theater and proscenium theater. There's a contradiction between good theater and bad theater,
mm,
right? There's contradiction between uh, sort of left-wing theater and theater of the right wing, let's say.
mm.
Yes, and there's no rule that says that the right wing can't use street theater. Sometimes they do,
Right.
and
Yeah.
there's nothing to say that the left can't use, proscenium theater. Some of our finest theater has happened on the proscenium stage. That's also fine. No problem with that.
Mm,
So the point I'm trying to make really is this: that there's no boundary that must be treated as, oh, we can't touch this, we can't do this, we can't do that. Of course,
mm,
now you have to be, at the same time, you have to be steeped in a tradition in order
mm.
to change that tradition. You can't come from the outside and say,
Right.
oh, I'm an urban, sort of English educated artist, so I have the right to go and start working with some rural, form
Mm,
and start making changes. No, you, of course, you can work with rural forms, and there are many instances of that too happening. Habib Tanveer being one, prime example, a great example of that. But in his case too, he steeped himself in the tradition first, in Raipur and so on. So uh, he'd seen Nacha performances from the time that he was a little child, and he
mm,
had grown up with those songs and so on. But also, as an adult, as a theater maker, he traveled extensively through Chhattisgarh
mm,
and experienced this theater for several years, almost 2 decades, before he started working with those forms himself, right? And so therefore, there is a way in which he steeped himself in the tradition,
yeah.
and that allowed him to start making changes in the tradition. So I believe that that's the way we have to work with this. We have to learn the traditions. We have to steep ourselves in it, and then you know use whatever is available to you at any
Mm,
point.
yeah.
Art and literature, you know, the rules, whatever are considered to be the rules, whatever is considered to be the canon. If you go against the canon, that's when you advance the field. That's when you bring in new ways of expressing yourselves. And the last point I want to make about this is that theater or any art is a language. And the point about language is that uh, nowhere do you find that it's always the other way around. The world changes. There are new things that happen in the real world out there, for
Mm,
which you need language to adapt, and you need language to find ways of expressing those changes. So
mm,
changes in language follow social changes, not the other way around. You know, and uh, and the same holds true for the language of art as well.
mm,
That there comes a time when you find that the old ways of expressing reality no longer serves the purpose of expressing the new reality, because reality keeps changing. And when that
mm,
happens, you have to forge new tools, you have to forge new expressions. And that's how you see in any art, in any, be it, let's say, graphic art, or any of the plastic arts, let's say, or in dance or in drama, in literature, etc. New ways of expression come into being when there
mm,
are social changes that happen, which is why you find that at times of revolutionary change, there's
mm,
suddenly a huge transformation in the arts as well. There's ferment in the arts as well. Why? Because the world is changing. The moment that happens,
mm,
this happened with the French Revolution, this happened with the Russian Revolution, it's happened with the Cuban Revolution, it happened with Indian independence, etc., etc. So any great social upheaval will bring in changes in the arts as well. That's natural. And that happens because the arts are ways in which we make sense of the world. They're languages. And because they're languages, they have to find ways of expressing the changes that are taking place in society. So I'm not a purist at all on this question. I believe that artists, especially radical artists, especially left-wing artists, must make use of all the tools that are available to us and more. Imagine more tools, forge new tools. Don't be stuck in the past. Don't say that, oh, because this person did it that way and that was a great artist, so therefore we must continue doing the same thing again and again. No. Uh, there's this famous debate of the 1930s, uh, which is essentially around what is realism in literature.
Yeah.
And so the debate gets the two important poles of the debate, although there are lots of people involved in it, but two of the important poles in the debate are Brecht on the one side and Lukács on the other side. And Lukács, of course, is holding up the example of the great 19th century Russian novel as being the most advanced form um, uh, of literary representation. And Brecht is saying, well, no, you can't do that. He's saying, what does Lukács want us to do? He wants us to write like Tolstoy, only better. Uh, you know,
Mm.
and I can't do that because I can no longer talk about, let's say, the impact of the stock market uh, in the modern world.
Mm.
I can't express that through the techniques of the Russian novel of the 19th century. I have to forge new techniques. And so the broken narrative, etc., etc. I mean, I'm not going into a discussion of the actual artistic breakthroughs, but the larger point I think is correct. That Brecht is saying the world is changing, and we need new languages to talk about this new world.
Comment, I mean, in fact, on that note, one of the things that you said was a period of ferment or a period of social change is also something which is reflected in the arts and the kind of techniques that they use, because ultimately the idea is how do you make sense of the world and do this through different medium. And perhaps maybe one of the things also is the fact that the need to have collectives or places where you have people not just from different art forms coming together, but also people from different walks of life, across different strata, across different experiences who come together to sort of allow these changes to be reflected in that art. So that's something. So how is it that you've been part of this broader movement for such a long time, and it's not something which is restricted to any one art form? I mean, you've traversed through different things, and you've also learned and sort of shared with many more artists. So how do you sort of bring about this fostering of this sort of a collective of progressive artists, if I could call it that?
Well, I mean, honestly, one doesn't think too much about these things. This is very much part of the tradition that we've been, uh, that we that we've been part of. I mean, after all, uh, it is true that, let's say, had the Bombay commune of the CPI not existed, what would the progressive cultural movement have been? And in the commune in Bombay, you had PC Joshi, who was the general secretary of the party, interacting closely with so many artists all the time on a daily basis. He's the one who tells Chittu Prasad, for instance, who was a young artist at that time, to go into Bengal and document the Bengal famine. He's the one who tells Sunil Jana, who was a young photographer at that time, virtually unknown, but a communist. And he tells Sunil Jana, pick up your camera, go to Bengal and document the famine. Because the mainstream media of that time, which was largely controlled by the British, is not going to talk about this. So therefore, our newspaper, the Communist Party newspaper, must tell the world the reality of the famine. And that's how some of the finest journalism of that period gets done. And it's quite interesting to me that some of that a large part of that journalism is so visual. that it's graphics and photographs that give the full sense of the horror of the almost genocidal proportions of the Bengal famine. Uh, so the fact that you have this, you have uh, theater makers of the time making a play like Nobanno. You have the theater and film artists coming together to make a film like Dharti Ke Lal, again produced by IPTA, etc. You have Bhukha Hai Bengal, etc. Now, all of these are ways in which artists who work in different forms, be they musicians, dancers, choreographers, actors, writers, theater directors, visual artists, etc., they all come together and create art. Either they create, either they collaborate on pieces of art themselves, as in let's say Dharti Ke Lal or Nabanno, etc., or even if they're doing single works by themselves, these works, you cannot make sense of these works unless you understand the context in which they were created, where these artists were interacting with such a large number of other artists from different art forms, and not just artists, but also interacting with communist activists, including trade unionists, including workers, peasants, etc., etc., etc. So this close connection between artists from various forms, the political activists, and ordinary people. It's a symbiotic relationship between all of them that produces this completely new culture of the 1930s and 1940s. There used to be a time when about Urdu poetry, for instance, it was said that in Urdu, if you were a poet, it meant that you were a revolutionary.
Right.
There was no other kind of poetry that was even conceivable in Urdu. There was such a dominance of revolutionary thought um, in Urdu poetry. So this comes about because of this much larger uh, context of, on the one side, ferment in society, on the other side, the coming together of so many different strands, so many different forms, so many different types of people, and uh, uh, and, and contributing uh, to making change in the world.
I mean, one of the reasons why, this becomes important, the fact that art, as you said, is a collaborative activity by definition. And one of the reasons why it becomes important then is also given the fact that what it means to be political as an artist is something which is also reflected in the sort of times that we're in. If you look at the fact that, I mean, it's not that this did not happen before, but you do see increasingly attacks on different artists across different sections of the political spectrum, as well as people who have consistently voiced their opinion against various forms of exploitation, oppression, and even forms of state oppression. And you see that this sort of attack on these different artists uh, seems to not quite get a response amongst the larger public. So how do you sort of see this current phase that we're in when we need to look at these attacks on artists and in general attacks on various fronts in our society? So how does sort of a collective respond to that?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to think about is really that the RSS, which is the ruling party in India, I think it's a fiction to say that the BJP is the ruling party. The BJP is a mere front of the RSS. It's a parliamentary front of the RSS. The party that really rules India is the RSS. And the RSS, in my view, is a fascist organization, extremely secretive. Uh, they have the Führer principle that is kind of entrenched at the very heart of it, and so on and so forth. Anti-minorities, patriarchal, and etc., etc. I don't need to go into all that. But the RSS has a very firm and a long-term view of the change that they want to make. in society, that they believe that uh, that that everything that the freedom movement gave us, that the entire tradition of the freedom movement is something that needs to be repudiated, that needs to be turned upside down, that needs to be wiped off from history. And so their view of it's not simply a question of, this election, that election. Of course, that's important for them. And so winning elections, winning state power is extremely important for them. There's no question about it. The BJP as a party, the RSS as an organization has reached where it has reached through a very clever use of state power at various points of time in its history, um, including in 1977 when the Janata Party, in my view, erroneously uh, decided to invite the Jan Sangh to be part of itself, which I think was a big mistake. Uh, but anyway, be that as it may, uh, the point is that at the moment, what the RSS is trying to do is really overturn everything that we know as India. So, for instance, just yesterday I was reading on my WhatsApp a message that was forwarded, which is one of those things that bhakts keep circulating, which is a sort of a so-called expose um, of a very fine writer in Bollywood, somebody that we all love and respect, and so on, and that made the argument that all of this man's work is part of film jihad, right? And the fact that this person has stood by secular values all his life, that's not the word that they use in the WhatsApp, but I'm saying that the fact that this person has represented secular values all his life through all of his work, whether film-based work or outside, is somehow a jihad, and that's what needs to be overturned and so on. So some of the current stuff that is happening around, let's say, this whole very unsavory uh, uh, playing out of the death of Sushant Singh Rajput, the way in which various Bollywood personalities, especially those who have aligned themselves to the right wing, have jumped into it, etc., and have used this opportunity to attack Bollywood, to attack what they think is the whatever words they use. I don't even want to use those words here.
Right.
It's a full-scale frontal attack. This is exactly the time when the organizer also published an article in which they named film stars, and they said,
Right.
especially those stars who have Muslim names, of questioning their patriotism, etc., etc. At the same time, one hears that there's a lot of pressure now on production houses, and so on and so forth. So what does all of this mean really? It means that they want to overturn uh, what is still, despite all the movies that get made from the right, that sort of represent the right wing view, let's say, that are celebrating of, let's say, the surgical strikes or whatever it is, right? That kind of stuff. Or I'm not trying to lessen that. I'm not trying to wish that away. That's there. It's all real. But despite all that, it is equally true that Hindi cinema and popular cinema in India today is still, broadly speaking, there's still a very strong secular element to it. There's still a very strong. Now, that's what they're trying to attack. That's what they're trying to delegitimize, because they understand that the only way that you can keep ruling this country is by changing the minds of the people, changing the culture of the people. Now, it's in that context, I think, that one has to see this is one of the contexts. I'm not saying this is the only context, but uh, I took the example of the film world only to make the point that the RSS is very conscious of culture at large, popular culture, right? They want to control popular culture. They've done that
Yeah.
through uh, in a big way through the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and so on and so forth. But this kind of popular culture, they've still not been able to fully control
Capture.
and and capture, and that's what they're now striving to do, I believe. In that whole thing, why is it that people who are being targeted today, who are being incarcerated, questioned, etc., so many of our comrades, so many of our friends are facing the threat of being imprisoned today?
Yeah.
We know that they are under surveillance and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at what these people are actually doing, it's doubtful how many people, um, let's say you make a documentary film, how many people actually see that documentary film? So
Right.
it's not the numbers per se that matter to them.
Hmm.
That's not the thing. But they understand that a documentary filmmaker has a prestige in society.
Correct.
And it's that prestige that they want to attack. By making the example of one documentary filmmaker, they want to silence every other documentary filmmaker. By making an example of one poet, they want to silence every other poet. By making the example of one intellectual, they want to silence every other intellectual. Why? Because intellectuals as a whole, filmmakers as a whole, poets as a whole, novelists as a whole, theater people as a whole, etc., etc. All of these are areas where society looks up to you, not as an individual but as an artist, I'm saying, or as an
Right.
intellectual. Your output is taken seriously. Now, why is it, for instance, that this absolute abominable text that Bloomsbury decided to publish, very unfortunately,
Correct. Yeah.
why is it that why is it that the RSS needed Bloomsbury? It's all very well for them to say, after Bloomsbury cancelled it, after they withdrew from it, it was all very well for them to say, oh, it's still British, colonial attitudes is yeah, it's the white people who are still dictating to us, etc. The fact is, you needed the white people. You went to them, and why do you need to Bloomsbury or such other publishing houses? You need to go to them because you don't have a single publishing house that carries that kind of prestige amongst intellectuals as a whole, amongst the intelligentsia as a whole. The intelligentsia, of course, being much wider than
Yeah.
professional intellectuals. The intelligentsia would include, let's say, journalists, would include the judiciary, etc., etc. The teachers and so on and so forth. So you need prestige there. You need your viewpoint also to carry a certain weight. So for them, it did not matter at all that the book was not sold or was sold, how many people read the book, etc. Didn't matter. That's not the point of that book. The point of that book and the reason why they wanted it published from Bloomsbury or a publisher like that, a
Yeah.
prestigious publisher, is because their worldview gets legitimacy through that. And of course, in this particular case, it's also very pernicious. It's also literally dangerous. I've argued this in print and I'll say it again, that this book has blood on its hands. And what do I mean by
Right.
that? I mean by that actually now you've seen this. The police
Correct.
charge sheet that has now been filed has verbatim quoted from the book, lifted entire
Correct.
passages from the book and quoted.
Yeah.
So literally the police version has been lifted from the book, which is why you need this book to become prestigious, because
So
you
that
want to
it.
pressure the judiciary, etc., etc., and because you want to build a certain narrative. Now, the work of artists and intellectuals, therefore, the point of it is not necessarily, of course, it's important to reach large numbers of people, etc. So I'm not trying to negate that. But the point of it is not simply the number of people that you reach. The point of it is also the kind of social prestige that this work gathers around itself. It's taken seriously. People think that you're making some important points when you work in these areas, and that's what they want to delegitimize. And that's the areas that they want to capture. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because literally they do not have the intellectuals. They do not have artists. They do not have, um, really talented people with them. The talent that they have, and I'm not denying that there's any talent, that there's no talented people with them. The talent that they have is in different areas.
Correct.
It's in, making these conspiracy theories. It's in fomenting violence. It's in changing the nature of language itself to be, full of poison and etc. etc. They have great talent at innuendo. They have great talent at dog whistling. They have great talent at double speak, etc. All of this is also talent. I'm not denying that. They have great talent at pretending to be who they are not. Right? They're great talent at that, no question about it. Right? But they do not have the talent of the truly creative people of this country, and they do not have the have the top artists of this country, the top intellectuals of this country, the people who are taken the most seriously. They do not have that talent. They do not have the talent of the large numbers of ordinary, you know, um, of people who earn to live, uh, uh, who earn their livelihoods but also make art.
Yeah.
The Lok Shahirs and the street theater people and so on and so forth, who are never seen as top artists,
Correct.
in quotes, but they play a very vital social role in society, and that's why, for instance, this attack on the Kabir Kala Manch, two of our comrades from Kabir Kala Manch. Why?
Correct.
Why the Kabir Kala Manch is ridiculous? It's a tiny group. How many people do they reach? But that's not the point. The point is that by terrorizing what they think, that by terrorizing the Kabir Kala Manch and a few people in that group, they are sending out a message to all those who do street theater, to all
Correct.
those who do shahiri, etc., etc. This whole tradition is something that they want to wipe out. You know.
I mean,
Sorry
as
that
you
it became a very long answer,
No, no. I mean,
but you got
perhaps
me kind of riled up.
it did require that sort of an answer. So, in fact, as we're moving into questions of more contemporary times, there have been quite a few requests for some questions to be asked to you from the audience which is present there. So, what I'll do is I'll sort of open it up. We have some time, so maybe we could put in about 2 or 3 questions from people who are on call here.
Sure.
I think Pindika had a question.
Hello, comrade.
Hi,
Uh,
Ambedkar. How are you?
yeah, hi. So I wanted to know. I mean, I've been thinking for some time that we left the Bollywood or the cinema for the cultural right. How can progressive artists, collaborate in producing short films or any of art form that can, give an alternate to the right-wing hegemony in the cultural space?
That's a great question, and thanks very much for asking that question. I think for a long time there's been this kind of slightly, this idea that the mainstream is not for us, that we are radicals, we are revolutionaries, so therefore we don't work in the mainstream. We will always be fringe, we will always work with alternatives and so on. I don't believe that's a good approach. I believe that it's very important to work with the mainstream in the mainstream as well. Uh, do that as well as whatever else you want to do. Actually quite relatively easy to produce works that in the electronic form quite widely. You can literally just do it with a smartphone and a laptop. It is possible to produce pretty good short films, to produce music, rap, or whatever it is, to produce audio content. You know, I'm a big fan of podcasts. I'm a big fan of the radio and so on. I think these are forms that the left must also make use of. I think the power of the radio has once again been made apparent to us by the right wing. It's the right wing today that's using the radio through the monthly broadcast. We all know what I'm talking about, right? But it's interesting that he chose to do that. It's interesting that he chose the radio and not the television to reach out to people. And it just shows you that there is power there which we've ignored. And I think that it's important for left-wing artists today to learn these technologies, to start experimenting with them, to start making short fiction or whatever form that you work in, you know. But to start thinking about how can our work circulate more and more. We have to circulate more and more, because otherwise you just leave the whole thing open to them. I should also just make a little point about the film world, let's say. And it's interesting to me, for instance, that I'm loath to give labels to this, but I would say that some of the finest work that I've seen recently has come from basically a progressive position. You know, you see some of the series that have been off late been showing on OTT platforms, on Amazon, Netflix, etc., etc. There've been very fine series that have been written, films have been written, etc. Just last evening, I saw this film called Me Raksam, which is about a Muslim girl uh, who starts to learn Bharatnatyam, and what that does to fundamentalists on both sides, Hindus and Muslims, in a village. How it just freaks them out. It's a lovely idea, right? And so there is possibility. And it's not a very big budget film. I mean, any film requires a budget, but as things go, it's not such a big. But today you can create a film and put it up on YouTube or on Vimeo or whatever it is, and you can circulate. Even if you don't put it up anywhere, you can still circulate it through WhatsApp or Signal or whatever it is that you use, let's say Telegram and so on. So I think that there's a great deal of need for us to create progressive content that can really move amongst the masses. One reason why a poet like Rahat Indori, for instance, who passed away recently due to COVID, one reason why there was such it was so interesting to see the reaction of the right wing and the reaction of trolls to Rahat Indori's death. Immediately, they started circulating, parodies of Rahat Indori's most famous, poems. And of course, their parodies were nonsense. They couldn't even write good parodies. They were just badly written parodies that had no sense of rhyme, meter, etc. Of which, Rahat Indori was such a master. But Rahat Indori, they need to attack Rahat Indori. Why? Because Rahat Indori was so popular. Rahat Indori wrote in an idiom that all of us understood. Everybody understood his poetry and everybody understood what he stood for. And he, of course, was a fantastic performer as well. Every time he stood up and performed, it was great, entertainment just to watch him. But his poetry was also very fine, and it used uh, all the strengths of the traditional poetry, but refashioned it in an idiom that was completely modern and that everybody could relate to. A poor person could relate to it, middle class person could relate to it, etc., etc. Now, uh, I believe that it's really important for left wing artists to create works like that and to not feel shy of broadcasting our view. In fact, today there is more and more need for us to just go out there and produce all kinds of things, whatever form that you work in, but produce works of art, now for a popular audience and for popular consumption.
I think we have perhaps time for one more question. There's someone with a question on here on the Zoom chat. I think Urvi had a question. Or yeah, Ishan, sorry. Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, hello. I actually, my question was, as you quite rightly pointed out, that they have been using the right wing, the BJP, the RSS, they've been making use of certain forms such as radio and other forms of uh, media proliferation to kind of get their message out there and kind of get people to their side instead. But given that the majority, like for example, internet penetration and smartphone penetration especially stands at somewhere of a maximum at 36% of the Indian population, and that most people get their news or get their ideas from the local tea shop, or these local newspapers that are kind of tailor made to their region, to their particular problems, discussing all of that. So how would you say we tackle that particular aspect of uh, uh, the media landscape, and to get our message out there? And given that all of this, and especially OTT platforms are also only available to a very small section of Indian society, so I just wanted some clarification there.
Uh, well, thanks, Ishan, and thanks very much for sort of bringing in this element that that technology is not class neutral. Absolutely, that's a point that there can hardly be any argument about that. Uh, but having said that, I think it's still instructive to look at what the right wing does. Look at what the RSS does. Why does the RSS need armies of trolls like this? Why do they need it? Let's ask ourselves this question. If opinion is not going to be made on Twitter, why go after people on Twitter? Why expend so many resources, so much energy doing that? Because you're absolutely right in saying that opinion gets made, let's say, at the local tea shop. Opinion gets made at the, inside families and so on and so forth. But uh, and opinion gets made through, let's say, local newspapers that respond to, etc. All the points that you made are correct. Where do opinions in those newspapers get made is the question. Where do the journalists who write in those newspapers, the, the, the editorial writers of those newspapers, where do they get their opinions from? After all, it's not like everyone just has opinions that are self-formed in your own brain. No, you're taking from other people all the time. You're influenced by so many things. And it's really instructive that the right wing should be so active on Twitter, particularly because, I mean, forget about internet penetrability, but Twitter is even a much smaller subset of that. Most ordinary people don't go to Twitter, right? Even people who have a smartphone, they might go to WhatsApp. But how many people who use WhatsApp use Twitter? It's a smaller subset of that. But Twitter is important to them. Why? Because Twitter reaches out to those people who write opinion pieces, who write the news, who create poetry, etc., etc., whatever. So it's really important for us to also think along those lines and not say that because internet penetrability is limited, because smartphone usage is limited, therefore we don't do, so what do? Right? We've been doing street theater for all these years. I mean, I'm not just saying me as in, we as in Janartimanch, but our movement as a whole has been doing street theater for donkey's years, right? And we have so many theater groups that are so powerful and so wonderful and so committed to people's movements and so on and so forth. And yet, we are not able to dominate thought in society. Ours doesn't become the dominant ideas in society. Why does that happen? Because forms of mass communication are still something that we've essentially stayed away from. And I think that needs to change in some way. Of course, it's not easy. Of course, it's a huge uphill battle. Even within that, we've seen now, for instance, how Facebook is also extremely biased, etc., etc. I mean, we know all that. We know how these platforms are also biased in this way or that. It's not level playing ground even there. But whatever it is, these are this is the world that we are living in. And if we want to make a change in this world, then we have to use the tools that are available in this world. Simultaneously, also, of course, our comrades in the free software movement are doing fantastic work to create alternative platforms, etc. We must aid that. We must work with those platforms, and so on. But At the same time, there is also what is called broadly the mainstream. And we can't abandon that. We can't leave that to the right wing, saying that, oh, internet penetrability, etc., etc. That's a false argument to my mind. Um, I'm not saying that you are making a false argument. I'm just saying that that uh, it's while the fact is correct that the internet and access to digital content is not class neutral. That point is 100% correct, 100%. Yet it's a more complex way in which these platforms work in society, and we as Marxists, we as communists, must understand that complexity and deal with it. That's the larger point I'm making.
Thank you.
Uh, yeah, unfortunately, Comrade, I think we sort of run out of time on what was scheduled. But thank you so much for spending time with us here and reaching out to this broader audience that we tried to do today. And also thank you for being with the AFPP right through its initial stages. And I'm sure we'll sort of have you here again, hopefully when things settle down, maybe in person, but also otherwise through this online medium. So thank you once again for being here.
Well, thank you very much, as I said, for having me. And I have to tell you that I'm so excited by the fact that AFPP has been sort of constituted, has been, this network now exists. And I believe that the network is growing. And that is just absolutely fantastic. I'm so thrilled by this. This is exactly the kind of initiatives that we on the left must have more of. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who is here at the talk, listening in or watching this through the YouTube channel that we have. And for any of you who are interested to be a part of the AFPP or receive updates about the kind of work that we do, we request you to sort of follow us on our social media handles. It's at the rate AFPP India on Twitter and Instagram, and the Facebook page is called AFPP India. And with this, we'll conclude this session, and hopefully we'll join you soon with another round of events, as well as continue our work as AFPP as a collective. So thank you, everyone. And that's it.